Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. The official title for today's talk, although it will include many other things, is a proposal for the formation of a worldwide Islamic state. And the reason I have chosen this for today's subject is that, you know, I think in an earlier talk that I've given, I referred to the fact that did I refer to human society as, if you looked at human society as a whole, you would have to consider human society insane? Did I say that in an earlier talk? Okay. Now, I'm never quite sure how serious people take me when I say that. But I am really, really serious when I say that. I mean, I'm saying it as a formal diagnosis as a highly trained clinical psychologist. I am saying that human society today is, if you consider human society as a whole, if there was a human being that embodied all of what human society is, you would want to lock that person up because they are that dangerous. And yet we just go on day by day with our lives and we don't do anything about it. And every day it gets a little bit worse. You see, it doesn't get a little bit better every day. It gets a little bit worse every day. Remember we talked before about how if you're not putting energy in to make an improvement or to move toward Allah, you'll move toward shaitan because of this concept of behavioral drift. You never drift in a positive direction. So for every single person in the whole world who doesn't do something every day to actually make the world a right place, they are actually helping to make the world a worse place. And when you consider how bad the world is today, I mean, you know, some of you in here are probably as old or almost as old as me, and probably can remember a time when the world was not nearly as bad as this. I mean, when I was in high school, even in the 1950s in America, I don't want to say America was wonderful, but it was sure wonderful compared to America today. And it would be, if any country in the world really almost, I think, was as nice today as America was in the early 1950s, it would be a pretty nice country. And that's America, which is now such a really terrible country. And then we have a country like Malaysia, which, having not only traveled to many, many countries, I've been in at least 50 different countries. I don't know, I don't keep track of the exact number, but the number would be over 50. And I've lived in probably about eight different countries. And I would say Malaysia is probably the nicest country I've ever lived in. And I don't know whether Malaysia is actually the nicest country in the whole world. It is really quite nice compared to a lot of the world. And there was a very interesting documentary I watched a few nights ago on the country of Norway, which, you know, I don't know about the rest of you, but I know virtually nothing in the world about Norway. You know, Norway is one of these really unknown places. It's sort of so far north in Europe and north of the Scandinavian countries, you can't relate to it from there. And I think it borders the old Soviet Union. And the whole hour documentary was about what a wonderful country Norway was. And it wasn't like a travelogue thing or a thing to, I mean, it wasn't done by people from Norway. They were just saying that Norway sort of sets the standard for being a really wonderful country, and how clean it was, and how it's one of the most modern countries in the world, and it's economically, I think, one of the highest standards of living in the world. And they just went on, and they show the cities, and I mean, I'd had no idea what Norway looked like. Really nice cities, you know, really nicely designed, really clean. It's like, for anyone who's been to Disneyland, you'll see these little, the people who are going around with these little things with a broom and a little dustpan, and if there's like any little piece of litter that hits the ground, there's someone there to get it right away, right? Same thing is true in Norway. You got people wandering around just getting every piece of litter as it falls. And it is so well organized, like if you want to go shop, you sort of go in, and instead of getting all the items, you just make a list of the numbers you want and take it to the counter, and somehow all the stuff gets there. And so, and they were showing all, you know, they have all these happy festivals, and everybody is really looking so clean and so shiny, and so it's an hour documentary, and 50 minutes of it, they're just telling how really wonderful, and almost like an aside. An aside means like something you just say that's not really related, but a little bit related, but it's not really part of the story. They just happen to mention at the end that the only problem the country has is that it suffers one of the highest rates of alcoholism and violence in Europe. You know, and I thought, wow. I mean, this is bizarre, you know. And they're showing an example of one of the nicest countries in the world, and they say the only problems it has is alcoholism and violence. And I think, when I say the world is insane, you know, there's just examples of this all over the place. Because these people, I mean, I would have thought the point was to say, even a country as nice as Norway is suffering huge problems, and they weren't even saying that. They were just sort of saying, it's really wonderful, it just happens to have a little, you know, quite a bit of violence and alcoholism. But that doesn't really take away from what a wonderful place it is. So, I think to myself, what really options are there for the world? There are not many options for the world. And because I have not been a Muslim all my life, although 25 years is quite a long time, I didn't grow up in Muslim culture. So there are things like questions I might ask myself, like, I wonder what Muslims think about this question. And I can't use myself as an example, you see, because I'm not a Muslim who grew up in an Islamic culture. So it's a little hard to say. And one of the questions that I wonder about is how many Muslims actually believe that there is no alternative in the world to have a right world except Islam. You know, I wonder, do Muslims believe that there can be any other right way of life? You know, any other right society? Or is everybody who does not have an Islamic society going to have a society full of problems? So you can answer that in your own minds, but I wonder about that. My own conclusion, of course, is that, and I feel you see, one of the nice things for myself is that my conclusions about Islam were not formed culturally. My conclusions about Islam were formed intellectually. And you would not believe how hard I have been on Islam as I study Islam. I mean, I have been harder on Islam as I have studied Islam than any other subject I have ever studied. Meaning, I set Islam to a higher standard and would everything I read with the idea, is there any possible way I could tear this truth apart? Because I want to be really, really sure. I've been doing this, you know, now for many, many years. And in Islam, now, because we have to separate now, what is Islam and what do Muslims believe? There are many things I have found that Muslims believe that, this is going to sound rude, but I think are total nonsense. But none of that is Islam. You know, there are these weird cultural beliefs that have crept into Islam. And to me, they are really strange. And I don't consider them part of Islam at all. They don't really bother me. I mean, you know, unless people try and impose them on others as Islam. But for the part that is really Islam itself, there is not one thing I have ever found a flaw in. And so I feel comfortable to say that Islam is really the perfect way of life. And if it is the perfect way of life, it should be the perfect way of life for the whole world. And when we look at how the whole world is, how really, really sick the world is. You know, we not that long ago had that horrible experience here, that 10-year-old girl gang raped and murdered by 3 men, right? Now, as horrible as that is, every day in the world, worse things than that happen. And that is not the worst thing that ever is going to happen. And things are going to get worse and worse. Even in a nice country like Malaysia, things are going to get worse and worse. I mean, things just don't get better, right? I would say only a few countries in the world are really sincerely trying to make things better for the people in their society. Because many of the countries in the world are just desperately trying to survive. I mean, probably the majority of the countries in the world are just struggling to survive. When you're struggling to survive, you're not so much worried about quality of life. You're worried about just keeping people alive. For all the faults the Malaysian government might have, and I don't want to pick them out, and you know, and I don't want to say there are lots of them, but of course every government has faults. I do truly feel, and I have felt ever since I have been coming to Malaysia, that the Malaysian government is sincerely interested in improving the quality of Malaysian society. Now that doesn't mean that everything they do improves the quality of Malaysian society, But I think that belief is truly there. And even in a country then like Malaysia, that has lots of benefits and not too many drawbacks, and a government that is interested in generally improving the society of the country, we still see in Malaysia, because I've been coming here now for 15 years, and for me, because I would come periodically, except for the last 4.5 years I've lived here permanently. But there is no doubt in my mind that the Malaysia that I first knew 15 years ago was a much nicer Malaysia than we have today. That's just in 15 years. You know, and that's not a very long time for a country to get a lot worse, particularly a country where the government is sincerely interested in bettering society. And I don't blame the government for it. I actually blame the influence of a very sick world society for this. You know, and also we all have to take some blame here in Malaysia that we are really doing very little. Certainly most people are doing very little to improve things. I mean, if I were to just make a guess at what percentage of people in Malaysia are actively involved in doing something to improve the quality of Malaysian society and do away with the severe social problems going on in Malaysia, hard to put a real number on it, but I would say maybe less than 5%. You know, I mean, that's just a guess, but I don't see a whole lot of it being done. And so today, I thought I would talk about a possible alternative. And I'm not even saying that I'm really proposing this, what I'm talking about today. I just want to bring it up as an idea. And which I mentioned before, that it is the creation of a worldwide Islamic state. Because I'm not really in favor of the creation of individual Islamic states. I mean, I can't tell for sure whether Malaysia is an Islamic state or not. I mean, you know, I would definitely call Malaysia an Islamic nation. Whether or not, well, I mean, I guess actually, by what I am going to define as an Islamic state, Malaysia clearly is not an Islamic state. But I really don't know who is. If I could just read one paragraph here, I want to read a little bit more later, but so you'll hear this paragraph again when I read the page. But it is not difficult to define an Islamic state. I mean, I don't know. Would anyone think it's really complicated to define an Islamic state? You know, I mean, is it going to take pages and pages, you know, a constitution and all this to define an Islamic state? Because if it is, I made a real error, because I've got it here in about 3 or 4 sentences, what an Islamic state is. An Islamic state is one which opts to conduct its affairs in accordance with the revealed guidance of Islam, which accepts the sovereignty of God and the supremacy of His law in all matters, and devotes its efforts and resources to ensuring the existence of a right society living in accordance with the will of God. So, do you think that has left anything out? If a country did all of that, do you think it would qualify as an Islamic state? So it's pretty simple. You don't think so? I think this is really quite simple, right? It's not a complex question whether or not a country is an Islamic state. And I'm sure that, and this is nothing, I'm not saying anything against the Malaysian government in saying this. I think the Malaysian government would acknowledge that they are not doing this, and they would say, well, we are a multicultural, multi-something religious country, and it's just not feasible to do all this. And that may be true. And I can accept that's true. How many countries in the world do you think, under this definition, are an Islamic state? Who do you think would be closest? It's really hard to say. Someone said Sudan. I haven't been in Sudan, so I don't know. I was in Yemen. Well, maybe. Obviously it should be Saudi Arabia. No, it should be. I said should be. Should be Saudi Arabia. When it is so clear, and I didn't make this up. I actually took all of this from various surah and interpretation of scholars about what Allah has told us, right? So, if you wouldn't mind, I would actually like to read you just the first page and one paragraph about this proposal for the formation of a worldwide Islamic state. And remember, I'm only proposing a thing to think about. It is perhaps true that the formation of the Islamic State will be quite complex in its eventual structure and application, but an initial proposal for the formation of an Islamic State can be offered quite simply. The Quran clearly and directly asks all human beings to surrender to God in complete submission and accept His guidance in every field of activity. Quote, "O you who believe, enter into Islam wholeheartedly, and follow not the footsteps of Satan, for he is to you an avowed enemy," unquote, of the Quran. Because Islam is a complete way of life, this divine guidance is for all matters, private and public, political and economic, social and cultural, moral and legal. In the godless secular nations, they require a separation of religion and state. Politics is to be made free from religious influence. In Islam, politics is a necessary element of the religious domain. Allah has told us He is to be the sole determiner of what is right and lawful. Quote, "Command is for none but God. He has commanded that you obey none but Him. That is the right path," from the Quran. And, quote, "If any do fail to establish and decide by what God has revealed, they are the unbelievers, the unjust, and the evildoers," from the Quran. 3 different surah. The political system in Islam is to help those it governs be successful in the practice of a right Islamic way of life. Quote, and grant me from thee a ruling authority to aid me," from the Quran. Unquote. An Islamic world society cannot have a secular political system. For the Islamic world to exist, there must be an Islamic state. What has a secular political system given the Western world? Admittedly, it has allowed them to gain great wealth, great power, and great technological expertise, but at what expense? Their secularism has brought with it skepticism in thought, confusion in values, expediency in its standards, vulgarity in its behavior, and opportunism in its diplomacy. Modern man has learned to fly through the air like a bird and swim through the oceans like a fish, but he has failed to learn how to live on the earth like a human being. So I'll reread the next paragraph. It is not difficult to define an Islamic state. An Islamic state is one which opts to conduct its affairs in accordance with the revealed guidance of Islam, which accepts the sovereignty of God and His supremacy and the supremacy of His law in all matters, devotes its efforts and resources to ensuring the existence of a right society living in accordance with the will of God. With the establishment of Sharia, including the implementation of Hudud, we must understand that this establishment should take place through gradual steps as the Ummah becomes comfortable with it. From the beginning, it needs to be stated and accepted that the goal is the full and complete establishment of Sharia, but that it is to be done only as quickly as is the consensual will of the Ummah. Notice that word there, the consensual will of the Ummah. Early attempts to introduce such practices as the cutting of hands of thieves will hinder, not aid, bringing full establishment of Sharia to the world. By the time we have an Ummah in consensual agreement that the time is right to introduce this punishment for theft, we will have a society so Islamically correct that there will be no need to cut the hands of thieves, since there will be no more theft in so right a society. The result of the initial clash between Islam and the world of the secularized West was to push Muslims into two opposing camps, the conservatives and the moderates. The conservatives became rigid in their outlook and approach as they sought refuge in old tradition. To them, every change was a change for the worst. The modernists wanted nothing of the old traditions. They wanted only to imitate the Western modes of thought and behavior. We need today a merging of these two camps into a powerful, united approach which accepts as right all traditional teachings of Islam and at the same time is progressive in all aspects of life and endeavor. We might refer to this as progressive conservatism, but actually it is only Islam rightly practiced. Okay, that's just the introduction to these ideas. Now, when I talk about the creation of a worldwide Islamic state, it's important to realize that an Islamic state is not made up of a territory. An Islamic state is made up of Muslims, independent of the territory. So a worldwide Islamic state is essentially a state acting as a political entity of which every Muslim in the world is a member. So you have one united Islamic state made up of every Muslim in the world, regardless of where they live. Now, Muslims live in basically three different kinds of, and also, because we know in Islam that everything belongs to Allah, right? Is there anything that doesn't belong to Allah? So, even if somebody claims they have a nation, that nation actually belongs to Allah. America claims it has a nation. They claim they are not Muslim, and they are not. But what they refer to as the nation of America, it actually belongs to Allah. every single bit of it. So, in the creation of a worldwide Islamic state, every so-called nation in the world would be designated as an Islamic nation, not an Islamic state, as an Islamic nation, recognizing the true ownership of that nation as belonging to Allah. And then those Islamic nations break up into more or less, not more or less, into three general categories, and there's a lot of variation in the categories, but basically three categories. There is the category of Islamic nation, where essentially everyone in the country is a Muslim and lives by Islam. Then there is the category of Islamic nations, which covers a wide range, where Muslims are a large portion of the population. This doesn't mean exactly half or 1/3 or 2/3. It just means that Muslims are a large portion of the population. And it could even include a country where Muslims were virtually all of the population, but not very interested in Islam, so that Islam was not prominent in the country. It might be that this particular second category should be broken up into two categories. And then this is why I say it's a little hard to say, because there's a lot of variation here. In the second category, I mean, there are some countries where the half or more of the country are Muslim, but it is considered a Christian country because it is ruled by Christians. You have a country like Malaysia, which half or more of the people are Muslim, and it is more or less ruled by Muslims and has an Islamic constitution. May be necessary to separate between those two. I'm not sure, but in general, we have countries where virtually everyone is Muslim. We have countries where a large portion is Muslim. Then we have countries where a tiny portion is Muslim. So we break it up into these three categories. But we say they are all three Islamic nations. And then we need to have a constitution. And it has to be a constitution that everyone would agree to. In the beginning, the countries that were that had a very small Islamic community would actually not get a vote in the setting up of the worldwide Islamic state and the constitution. The reason being is, before the Islamic state was set up, they would not be organized in a sense as to have anyone to speak for the consensus of the Islamic Ummah within their country. So those who would have a vote and a decision in the initial constitution would be only the Islamic countries that had an Islamic body within them that could speak for them. And I know not everybody might favor the OIC, but the best body I could think of at the moment representing what we are talking about as the people who would be, as the group of nations, Islamic nations, that would set up such an Islamic state, would be the OIC nations. Although even a couple of those, I'm not quite sure they're Islamic. if I'm not mistaken, one of the OIC nations has about 3% Muslims. Somehow or other ended up being in Islam, getting into the OIC. So the Constitution, you don't want to start with a real complicated Constitution. So you need to start out with a simple statement of what the Islamic State is in the beginning. And I think that it would really be nothing more than saying that there would be a public acknowledgement of the existence of the worldwide Islamic State, that the worldwide Islamic State consisted of every Islamic nation in the world, and every nation in the world was defined as an Islamic nation, and a explanation of the three different classes of Islamic nations. And that really is almost enough for the beginning, because you don't want to take too big a step in the beginning. The second step is to say what the goal is, what the long-term goal is. And in talking about the long-term goal, it would have to be made really clear that although countries were accepting this as the long-term, the voting countries in the initial setting up of the Constitution for the worldwide Islamic State, although they were voting this as the long-term goal, they were not committing at any particular time to do this. They were just saying this is the goal. They were not saying that they will do any particular thing at any particular time to achieve it. And I think the goal should be exactly that paragraph that I have read twice and which I won't read again. But that is a very clear and concise goal. And I think it would be very hard for an Islamic country if they knew that a body was being set up that, because of the way it was set up, could never obligate them to do anything to help achieve that goal. Never obligate them, right? They only do things as there is a consensus to take steps to move toward that goal. Because of course somebody would be really worried if, say for instance, you went to a country and said that you are going to accept the sovereignty of God and His supremacy and the supremacy of His law in all matters. Well, many countries would say, well, we just can't do that. Our Constitution doesn't allow us to. Okay, fair enough. So until they were ready to, they don't have to. But do they think it is a nice goal? I mean, I could well imagine the Malaysian government accepting a goal like that if they knew there was never going to be any pressure put upon them, and there would be never any obligation put upon them to make any particular step toward that goal until all of the people of Malaysia wanted to take that step. And so this is how it would have to be set up. Now it looks like it would be moving very slow, and it may move very slow, but there are some benefits also. And then another thing the Constitution would have to do is set out a means to achieve this goal. And in the means to achieve these goals, it would have to be really clear that there was in no way any compulsion on any country to do any particular thing that the Islamic State, worldwide Islamic State said. In other words, the worldwide Islamic State does not tell any Islamic nation what they must do, and that there is no punishment for non-compliance, but there is always reward for compliance. So what I'm trying to do with this is set up a situation which is a always win, never lose situation, where you can only gain, but you have no possibility of loss. And then the last thing is in the Constitution, that after the Constitution was drafted, there would have to be a consensus in the beginning for the Constitution, and that agreement to have consensus would have to be in what's called in perpetuity. In other words, if there were ever to be made any change in the Constitution, it's not like in America you need a 2/3 vote, or somewhere you need maybe 50% vote, or somewhere if you have a dictator you need just the dictator to say so, right? That every single Islamic nation would have to agree in consensus if there were any change made in the Constitution. Now, I say this one is important because I'll just read a paragraph here if I can. It is likely the main objection a national government may make to becoming a member of the Islamic State would be that although they can agree to all aspects of the Islamic State initially presented, they might fear that by becoming a member, they might be obligating themselves to something later to which they could not agree. Any fear of this possibility becoming reality can easily and completely be eliminated by including in the Constitution a firm, binding, and irreversible commitment that no decision, action, or requirement can ever be binding on the members of the Islamic State unless there has been a consensual agreement by all members of the Islamic State. In this way, the government of every member nation can be assured that the Islamic State will never do or require anything they are not in complete agreement with. Now, this puts them in a situation where it is really hard to see any possibility of a loss or a problem. In other words, if you don't agree, then the whole Islamic State does not take that position, does not make that requirement, does not take that action. And I know this sounds very limiting in the beginning, right? And it will be. In the beginning, the Islamic State would not be doing very much because we have such wide variance within what Muslims around the world would agree to that you're not going to have much happening. But one of the things to consider is, let me finish talking about, before I tell what the big benefit is, let me just talk about a few other things here. One of the things, though, that would be very important in how the Islamic states dealt with each other is this, and there's a lot of reasons behind this, that the Islamic State would encourage preferential political, social, and economic interaction between individual Islamic State members. In other words, all the members of the Islamic State would get special preference politically, socially, and economically. that the Islamic State would encourage preferential political, social, and economic interaction with those nations which are not members of the Islamic State, that reciprocate interactions on the basis of correct Islamic principles. In other words, for countries that are Islamic countries, they would deal with each other on a basis of preference. For a country that was not an Islamic country, they would be dealt with just as if they were an Islamic country, if and only if they will deal with you on the basis of Islamic principles. And the third category is those non-Islamic nations that the Islamic State would interact with courteously, but that they would not interact, those non-Islamic nations that would not interact on the basis of correct Islamic principles, who would refuse to, that although the Islamic State would act toward them in a courteous manner, that they would get no preference in political, social, and economic interaction, and all political, social, and economic interaction would be kept to the minimum that circumstances made necessary. So if there was a product you needed that was only made in a non-Islamic country and they refused to deal with you on the basis of Islamic principles, you go ahead and deal with them anyway. Only on that thing that you can't get anywhere else. On all other things, you just say, we don't deal with you. I probably shouldn't make my suggestion here that such a process here as this could be used, and I'm not really suggesting it too seriously, because it would be too dangerous to do, of course. But there could be a redress of a lot of exploitation that has taken place in the world, where those countries, those non-Islamic countries who did not want to deal with the Islamic State on the basis of correct Islamic principles could pay perhaps $100 a barrel for their oil. And those countries that are getting preference could pay perhaps $5 a barrel for their oil. And we could redress a lot of exploitation and financial inequities with a means like that. We could, but I don't think we would be allowed to. And of course, we wouldn't want to do anything that would annoy people so badly that they would want to attack us. You know, you don't want to start an Islamic State and then start a war. You want to start an Islamic State and show what a nice example an Islamic State could be in the world. And I mentioned earlier that I am not overly enthusiastic about countries unilaterally defining themselves as Islamic nations. You know, right now, Islamic nations are in trouble anyway. I mean, if you are an Islamic nation, you're probably on the list of, you know, likely terrorist or at least potential terrorist, or keep a real close eye on those people if they try and come to your country, something like that. So, and if a country just on its own wants to declare itself to be a Islamic nation, that without an Islamic state, I mean, not an Islamic nation. Say, for instance, Malaysia wanted to declare itself an Islamic state and introduce full Sharia and all of these things that I said. Well, number one here, without consensus among the nation's citizens, there will be significant opposition within the country. We don't want that. That's no way to start an Islamic state. So I would, for that reason, suggest it's probably not a good idea for Malaysia, or a country like Malaysia. Without consensual support of other Islamic nations, some will, for various reasons, oppose the creation of the Islamic nation. You're not even going to get support from all the Islamic nations for the stating yourself as one. And then standing alone, small and weak, the non-Muslim Western nations, a country that has unilaterally declared itself an Islamic nation, standing alone, small and weak, that the non-Muslim Western nations will oppose it strenuously. So there is, to just make for a country to just declare itself a Islamic nation, particularly at this time in world history, is probably not a good idea. Just a couple of more brief things I would like to read here. That the idea that there should and must be a separation of church and state, which the West has taken to mean God and state, is one of the many ideas from Western secular materialism that stands between humanity and a right world. Now, they are very attached to that idea, of course, but I think we need to have a position from a worldwide Islamic state to say that we do include God and religion in our politics. There should be no separate. Instead of there should be, separation of God and state. There should be no separation of God and state. I mean, they have it absolutely backwards here. And that this is something that I think it is very, very important that a Muslim state, or actually Muslims all over the world, this is an important idea that must be given to the people in the West. The non-Muslim world must at least consider possibility that Islam is indeed the right way of life ordained for all humankind by God. I mean, you can imagine right now that, of course, they don't at all. And they don't probably even realize that we do, and that we take it very seriously. And we take it very seriously not because we are naive and superstitious. We take it very seriously because Islam is logically and reasonably an ideal way of life. And all this is really saying is, like we are sure that this is the way of life ordained for all humankind by God, but they are not. But what I'm saying is here, they need to consider the possibility that it is. And they need to be told by the Islamic world that they need to consider that possibility. They don't have to accept it, right? I go on to say, we realize how unlikely, even impossible, this possibility must seem right now to most of the world's non-Muslim people. We would never ask them to accept this truth simply because we do. The path from confirmed unbelief in any truth to belief is always very difficult. All we may fairly ask at this point in human history is for non-Muslims to remain sufficiently open-minded to allow us the opportunity to prove the truth of Islam by living and believing our religion. And I think that's not very much to ask. I mean, I think given the so-called human rights standards of the Western countries, we should at least be allowed to be given that. We are not, of course, but I think we should. Right now, nobody is strong enough to stand up and say that we should. Which gets to the real point of this I didn't actually finish it. So, in those countries such as the United States, which we would designate as an Islamic state, that in every Islamic state, if there is an Islamic government, then the representative to the Islamic state, to the worldwide Islamic state, is the government. But in those countries that do not have an Islamic government, that those countries should set up within themselves as an Islamic community government, one government for all Muslims within that country. Say, for instance, all the Muslims in the United States. They set up a United States Islamic government. And they can have whatever form of government they want. I mean, in Islam, all sorts of governments are possible. But the purposes of that government would be the goal that is set here. Except, if I can find the place where I can't find it, but I'll just have to say it, that in every country you set up an Islamic government, an Islamic community government, or government of the Islamic Ummah, or whatever you want to call it. And you set it up on the basis that you do not go against in any way any law of the land. The purpose of the government is to run the affairs and look out for the interests of the Muslims in the country. And so once this is set up, this organization would function as the representative of the Islamic nation of the United States in the worldwide Islamic state. So every country in the world would end up being represented in the worldwide Islamic state. The ultimate purpose being, of course, which I really hadn't mentioned along the way, that I'm sure everyone has noticed how weak our Ummah is, and how there is no country that stands up and says anything for anybody. But if we had one group, a worldwide Islamic state, representing Muslims in every single country in the whole world, that even if we were not doing very much, And even if in the beginning the countries did not have great agreement as to what should be done, the mere fact of having one political body representing 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, in 200 or so countries, would make that organization an extremely powerful political organization. So anyway, that is basically a brief overview of the plan for the formation of a worldwide Islamic State. Just an idea to consider. I don't want to say for sure whether it should be considered seriously enough to actually try it or not. But I think that it is certainly serious enough to give some thought to. That it is a way to gain back to the Muslim Ummah not only some political power, but really a very large degree of political power. It would make it the single largest, well, not knowing the exact population of China, but make it close to the single largest political entity in the world. Which I think would have to be dealt with. Of course, we would have to be very careful, something like this, to always be very fair, honest, and positive in dealings with everybody, not to be belligerent, not to be warlike, not to be threatening, not to be coercing, to just, as I said, no penalties for non-compliance, lots of reward for compliance. And I think that it would be a really nice example for those countries that were non-Muslim countries to have the opportunity to deal with the Islamic nations on the basis of Islamic principles and see how really nice they are to use. I mean, most people don't use them because they don't have an opportunity. Everyone just uses the standard Western capitalist model. When dealing with the West, you deal with the West on their terms. What we would be saying is, you want to deal with us, you deal with us on our terms, because we believe our terms have been set down by God. Your terms have just been made up by man. So you want to deal with us, you deal with us from the way we believe is right and have been told is right by revelation. If you don't want to, then don't deal with us. And we won't have anything against you other than we won't deal with you. All our dealings will be courteous, but we just won't deal other than under correct Islamic principles. And I think most countries would choose to deal with us on the basis of Islamic principles. And they would find out that they work a lot better than the capitalist Western principles. And it would be a very good example. We are reaching the time for a break. There's a couple of things I want to tell you. Tomorrow's talk is going to be a talk on parenting. But for those of you who have ever seen me do a parenting talk before, this one is going to be a very different parenting talk. It will probably be different than any kind of parenting talk you have had before. Certainly different than my standard parenting talk. The other thing is, we had initially, we had never really had a specific plan as to how many talks there would be. And unfortunately, in recent times, there have been some indicators to me that I might be getting a bit worse fairly quickly. So time might be critical. So tomorrow's talk is going to be the last one in the series, because I want to start devoting all of my time to action, to help change things, as opposed to just telling people about things. But I hope that doesn't mean the end. Is Dr. Aziz here? Where is he? If I could, before the break, if you could just introduce this idea and hand these out. You know, as I said before, it is really not a very worthy thing to do in the world, to know that we have all these terrible problems and to know there is a solution. If from the things you have heard in here, you think there might be a real solution, and I'm convinced that there is. By the way, in our weekday class, which is also coming to an end in a week or so, we did a survey of how many people believe that this idea put into practice could literally change the whole world from what it is today to a fully and truly Islamic world. And the average, on a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being no chance in the world, 10 being absolutely certain, the average was 8.92, which is a pretty good average. Meaning that and I think certainly over half of the people believe put down a 10. All I can say to you is everything that I know and have learned all these years tells me that this is a real chance to actually make a change. And not because it's my work. I mean, it isn't my work, really. It's a whole lot of people's work that I have brought together. And even the bringing together of it, I don't want to take credit for, because this is a blessing of Allah, who has allowed me to see the connection of these things and put them together in a way that might be of benefit to the Ummah. And so, and I have looked at many different options and many different plans to help make the world a better place. And I haven't seen one yet that works. And I think that if you consider what's going on in the world today and you say to yourself, where is there a plan being put into practice that is really changing things and really making things better? I really don't know of many or any. And as far as a whole country doing it, and I think an idea like this, I think Malaysia is an ideal country for something like this to happen in on a very large scale. Certainly, if you were to ask the question, is there any country you could pick that is really doing something to greatly improve their society, to get rid of all the social ills in their society and help make the world a better place? What country is that? Well, I think we have to say absolutely none. And I am as convinced as I can be that Malaysia could take an idea like this and be that country, one that could turn around all of these terrible things. Like we mentioned, we've seen, all of us, in the past 15 years, a huge decrease in the rightness in Malaysia. And it's going to get worse, believe me. And it's going to get worse at an accelerating rate unless somebody does something. So this seems to be a workable idea. It's not a workable idea because, you know, I'm some famous sheikh or something, or leader of some Sufi tariqa or something where every word they say is believed. I mean, My words are only to be believed if they are logical and reasonable and fit with the facts and fit with Islam. Right? The fact that they come from me mean nothing. It is the words and the ideas that are important. And I will be gone soon, and all that we will be left is the ideas. And I don't even put my name on the ideas because I accept the ideas belong to Allah and to the Ummah. So I think we sit here at this point with the possibility of having the real opportunity to do something to change not only Malaysia but the world. And is there a reason why the camera is way over there? Why that wide angle? Very wide angle. I thought somebody was doing something of more interest than me. Which, considering I was talking about transforming the whole world into a fully and truly Islamic world, I thought they must be doing something really spectacular. Anyway, I think that's where we're at, right? I think we sit here with an opportunity to really do something to fix the problems of the world and seriously fix them. I mean, get rid of everything that is wrong and end up with a fully and truly Islamic world, and do it in a way that is not going to offend anyone, not going to cause a fight with anyone, not going to get anyone to hate us or just really by doing what we can do within the Muslim Ummah and people finding that so attractive that they will be wanting to join in. And I think such a change of the significance from the world, which is a really quite terrible world we have today, to a fully and truly Islamic world, could, if the means to achieve it were maximized, and this includes no negative means at all, that within a generation or so, we could have that fully and truly Islamic world, or at least be so close to it that the world we had within a generation or so would seem almost like a paradise compared to the world we have today. So, for example, say for instance, people wanted to go out and talk to parent groups about parenting. We will develop, we have some materials already, and we are developing some more materials, and we will be developing like a training program, so that if people want to do this, they can start on a small scale just with a few friends, and if you feel comfortable with it and good about it, then you could move up and speak to larger groups. But we will have training, because this house here is actually two things at the same time. It is the headquarters of the Khalifa project, and it is the headquarters of the Khalifa training project, which is a separate thing, which is what the main daytime class was about. And so some of the people who have been through the daytime class, they're going to start becoming full-time trainers, but also they could help train people who have been through just part of the classes, like you have here, or anyone who is interested really. And the ideas are simple enough where if you were to watch a couple of CDs about how to train parents, the idea itself is so simple that you can go out and with the materials that we would have to give, because we're developing a quite extensive brochure that gives enough information for any parent who would use the suggestions that we have in this brochure. We can guarantee them that they will have they will see positive changes in the raising of their children. So the opportunities are really large, and we hope some of you will take advantage of them. So we can hand these out now, and we can have a bit longer break than usual, How long's our break? Usually a half hour? Well, we'll have a half hour today, so maybe you can talk a little bit among yourselves and take time to look at these and fill these out. Hopefully, once again, there are refreshments out there. I never know, but usually there are. So, thank you, and we'll start again about 5 minutes to 5.